The apartment was small, tucked away on the top floor of an old brick building that had long since lost its charm. The chipped paint on the walls and the creaky wooden floors gave the place an air of neglect. It had been home to Emily and her 5-month-old son, Noah, for just over a year. Life had never been easy for her. She had moved to this quiet, unfamiliar town to escape a painful past, leaving behind a failed relationship, the constant judgments of her family, and the suffocating small-town whispers. She thought starting fresh would help her heal, but being alone with an infant in a town where she knew no one had only deepened her isolation. Her days were long, exhausting, and filled with endless worry about money, food, and keeping a roof over her head. And now, she had been sick for days, feverish, weak, and coughing so hard she felt like her lungs would collapse. But she had to keep going for Noah's sake. No one else was there to help. On the 4th day of the fever, Emily could barely stand. She hadn't eaten in 2 days and had used the last of her energy to feed Noah. Every movement was a battle, her vision swam, and the walls seemed to close in on her. She was too sick to go to the doctor and too afraid to ask for help. Her only contact was the elderly landlord downstairs, who kept to himself and hadn't checked in on her in weeks. That night, after putting Noah to sleep in his crib, Emily collapsed onto the couch. The world spun violently around her, and her limbs felt as if they were made of lead. Her breathing became shallow, her chest tightened painfully, and in that moment, she knew something was wrong, terribly wrong. She wanted to get up, to check on Noah, but her body refused to move. Panic gripped her, and she tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper. Darkness crowded her vision, and in a final, desperate moment, her thoughts were of her baby. Who would take care of him? He was just 5 months old. She couldn't leave him. And then, there was nothing. The days passed unnoticed. Noah's cries echoed through the apartment, but there was no response. His small, innocent wails turned into desperate sobs as the hours ticked by. The apartment grew cold, and the stench of decay began to settle in the air. Emily's body lay where it had fallen, still and cold, her life stolen by illness. No one came. The neighbors weren't the kind to check on each other. The old landlord downstairs was nearly deaf and didn't hear Noah's cries through the thick walls. It seemed like an eternity, but in reality, it had only been a few days since Emily's death when something shifted. It began on the 3rd night. Noah's cries, now hoarse and tired, broke through the stillness of the night. The room was dark, save for the dim streetlight filtering through the blinds. And then, from the shadows near the doorway, something moved. A figure, familiar but wrong, stepped into the nursery. It was Emily. Her pale skin was stretched too tightly across her face, and her eyes, though open, were vacant, clouded with the dullness of death. She moved stiffly, her joints creaking, her limbs jerking unnaturally as if her body was being controlled by invisible strings. She stood over Noah's crib, her head tilting unnaturally to the side as she gazed down at her baby. Noah stopped crying, his wide eyes staring up at her in confusion. He didn't know. He couldn't know. To him, it was his mother, just as she had been before. Emily reached down, her cold, lifeless hands gently lifting Noah from the crib. She cradled him, rocking him back and forth, her face a grotesque mask of love and death. She began to hum softly, the same lullaby she had sung to him every night when she was alive. The sound was eerie, hollow, as though it were coming from deep within her chest, not from her lips. The next morning, the apartment was silent again. Emily's body was still in the living room, decomposing in the same spot where she had collapsed, but Noah was calm. He had been fed. His diaper had been changed. And in the dim morning light, his crib was neatly made, as though someone had tended to him during the night. As the days passed, the routine continued. Noah would cry, and in the dead of night, Emily would return. Each time she appeared, her movements became more unnatural, more mechanical. Her body was decomposing. Her clothes, the same ones she had died in, were stained with the sickly yellow-green of decay. Her skin sagged, her eyes sunk deeper into her skull, and yet, she kept coming back. Every night, she would pick up Noah, rock him, feed him, and hum that terrible, haunting lullaby. The apartment, meanwhile, grew rank with the stench of death. Flies began to gather, buzzing around the lifeless form of Emily's body. But no one noticed. No one came to check. It was as if the world had forgotten that the small apartment existed. Then came the scratching. It started faintly, just a soft, scraping noise that seemed to come from inside the walls. At first, it was barely noticeable, but each night, it grew louder. The sound crept through the apartment, from the nursery to the living room, as though something was trying to get in, or out. It wasn't just the sound of rats or insects. It was deliberate. Intentional. One night, as Noah lay in his crib, the scratching grew frantic, like claws raking against the walls, trying to break free. The air in the room grew heavy, oppressive. The temperature dropped, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse, like they were alive. Suddenly, Emily appeared again, her decayed form emerging from the darkened hallway. But this time, something was different. Her head twitched unnaturally, and her mouth, usually silent except for the lullaby, stretched into an impossible grin. Her lips cracked, bloodless and dry, as she moved toward Noah's crib. She reached out, her cold, bony fingers brushing against Noah's cheek. But before she could lift him, her head jerked violently to the side, and for the first time, her mouth opened. Noah. Her voice was no longer her own. It was guttural, inhuman, a rasping whisper that seemed to come from the very walls around them. I can't leave you. Suddenly, the scratching intensified. The walls seemed to tremble, and from within the cracks, a dark, oozing substance began to seep out, as if the very apartment was bleeding. The shadows swirled, coalescing around Emily's lifeless body, which still lay untouched in the living room. Emily's form in the nursery began to contort, her limbs bending at grotesque angles as if something was trying to pull her apart. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices hissing and echoing through the room. And then, with a sickening crack, Emily's body twisted violently, her head snapping backward. But still, she clung to Noah, her decayed fingers curling tightly around him. The air grew thick with the stench of death, the walls groaned as though the apartment itself was in agony, and the scratching, the endless, relentless scratching filled the room until it was unbearable. Days later, when the landlord finally noticed the overwhelming stench emanating from the apartment, he called the authorities. They found Emily's body, rotting and bloated on the living room floor. The smell was horrific, and the apartment had become infested with flies. But Noah was alive. He was found in his crib, weak but unharmed, though his eyes were wide with terror. What the police couldn't explain, however, was how the baby had been cared for. His diapers had been changed, and somehow, impossibly, there were signs that he had been fed. As they carried Noah out of the apartment, the baby's eyes never left the doorway, where the faint outline of a figure still lingered. It was Emily, watching, waiting, her hollow eyes fixed on her son, her body barely more than a shadow now. And as the door closed, sealing the apartment for good, the scratching began once more, soft but insistent, as though she was still there, trapped between life and death, unwilling to let go. The apartment was never rented again.